This episode of the World War II podcast is brought to you by forceswarrecords.co.uk. With Remembrance Sunday just gone, those that have served have been in our thoughts. Why not look into your own relatives' wartime service or even those names on your local war memorial? Forces War Records is a great starting point for any military research on the British and Commonwealth forces. I've been looking at my local war memorial and I'll post my results on the website. For a 40% discount on 1 month or a year's subscription, use the offer code WW2podcast. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at Churchill's rise to power and Britain's decision to stand and fight in 1940. I'm joined by John Kelly. John's new book, Never Surrender, takes us through the crisis of the late 1930s, looking at the political machinations in Britain set to the background of those events unfolding in Europe and ultimately the collapse of France, ending with Britain standing alone to face the Battle of Britain. If you're looking for a good book for the holiday season, I can highly recommend it. You'll find a link on the website. Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister in 1937 when Stanley Baldwin stood down. Rather than calling an election, with 3.5 years remaining of the current Parliament, he decided to wait. He was aged 68 and had spent the previous 6 years as Chancellor of the Exchequer, where the Labour leader at the time, Arthur Greenwood, had attacked him for his rearmament spending, stating that the rearmament policy was the merest scaremongering, disgraceful in a statesman of Mr. Chamberlain's responsible position, to suggest that more millions of money needed to be spent on armaments. So, John, what was he faced with in 1937?
He's faced with a population that doesn't want war, and he's faced with a budget that makes war, the kind of war that would have to be fought, very difficult. The British Chiefs of Staff, since 1934, had been warning Germany was becoming a military threat again, and that rearmament was necessary. But Baldwin penny-pinched and Chamberlain did. There was a depression, but secondly, British finances were really in grave difficulties. There was almost no public support for any kind of rearmament or for stepping in when Hitler marched into the Rhineland and later when he marched into Austria. There was no public will to oppose that in Britain or in France. In a sense, Chamberlain didn't have any alternatives, although he was in sympathy with the public mood. And it has to be said in his defense that he did set aside, while Chancellor of the Exchequer, I believe, he did begin setting aside funds for the RAF so that the rebuilding could begin. Chamberlain was a really smart man, and I think he would have made maybe even a great peacetime prime minister. But he wasn't built for war, and he had no idea how to fight it. I mean, in 1939, his strategy was basically blockade, which Germany's connection with Russia left a gaping hole in it, and propaganda, and the sea war. He didn't want to commit as few troops as possible. And there was no way in the world that combination was going to have any effect on a power as great as Germany. I know Germany was having its own economic difficulties then, but it was continuing to rebuild. Chamberlain did not acknowledge this in terms of the army and the ground war. I mean, their commitment was 10 divisions, and I don't think all 10 divisions were in France until March or April of 1940. And indeed, if you look at the documents, this strategy of Chamberlain's I've described remained the government strategy until about March of 1940. In a sense, they were living in a dream world, but also in a sense, they were responding to public opinion. He was responding to public opinion. In order to get the British public, the sanction of the British public, I think there had to be some major catastrophe, as indeed there was.
Well, he's obviously now lambasted for being an appeaser.
I think the appeaser accusation against Chamberlain has to be put in the context of the tools he had available to him. That year between Munich and Poland, it at least bought time for Britain to step up its rearmament program, whether that was simply serendipity or whether it was always in the back of Chamberlain's mind is unclear. But any judgment, final judgment about him has to take that into account. And I have to say, when I began following what was the heart of the book, the debates about whether or not to seek a compromise peace, I was really impressed at his ability to stand back and frame the issues for the other members of the war cabinet, including Churchill. In the sense, here are our choices, and here are the likely effects if we make choice A or if we make choice B or choice C. I mean, he really had a good mind, and a good political mind in that sense, or strategic mind.
Year after Munich, you point out that he was actually seen as a hero, which is not something I'd ever thought of it like that way. That's been brushed under the carpet, how the world viewed him actually at the time.
The response to that wasn't simply enormous in Britain, it was enormous across the world. France, the United States, and Roosevelt, I didn't get this in the book, but Chamberlain returned from Munich. Roosevelt sent him a note which said, "Good man." It was just universal relief. I think it's almost impossible for us to imagine what it felt like to live in the shadow of a war in 1938 when the last war, which had cost Britain 1 million men, was only 20 years in the past. I mean, that means 1995, if we were going to do a kind of mind exercise. How heavily that would weigh on people. It's difficult for us to imagine, but I think it certainly explains the intensity of relief that Munich caused. Although, as I also point out, it didn't last for long. The agreement was signed on September 30th. And by the end of October 1938, there were already signs of some weakening. It was a transient bump. I quote one man saying, "Living with Hitler was like living with a wild animal in the neighborhood. You never knew when and how he was going to attack, so you lived in constant fear." And when the Germans marched in and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, not just the German-speaking parts, the Sudetenland, which Chamberlain had ceded at Munich, people knew a war was almost certain. And the attack on Poland obviously meant that Britain was going to go in the war. And even though it had sort of dragged France into it in September of 1939, because the French were looking for every excuse to pull back. They were slow to mobilize. They were even more wary of going to war than the British. And again, that's understandable. France lost 1.5 million dead and 4 million wounded during the Great War, and that was in a country of 40 million.
As you say, they invaded Poland, and on the 2nd of September 39, Churchill once more takes up a government post, and he had been in the wilderness. How did it come about that he gets asked back into the government?
There was a lot of pressure in the Conservative Party to bring Churchill into the government. There was even talk at the beginning of September by some Tories about making him prime minister. This was Chamberlain's way of basically countering that threat, or the threat of a Conservative Party revolt against him. He probably could have beaten it down, but the government looking divided at the beginning of a war would have been terrible for public morale. But Chamberlain brought her in for political reasons. And, he was wary of him. He always sort of felt he had to keep an eye on Churchill. And in truth, he did. Because if you think of Norway, Churchill's record in those first 10 months of the war was not stellar. I mean, Norway was a terrible mess. As First Lord of the Admiralty, that was mostly a naval-based operation. And during the let's just say all of April 1940, Churchill kept changing the targets that he wanted the Navy to attack. It would go from Trondheim to Narvik to Trondheim again. I mean, he made 4 changes of mind in that period about what targets he wanted the Royal Navy to attack. It led to using the Navy ineffectively. And also, at that point, he still didn't understand how much naval power had changed the effectiveness of sea power. He wouldn't really learn that until the summer of 1940. By that point, he did realize it. Really, when I read over the Norway documents, it was almost like reading Gallipoli again. I'm not kidding. I mean, there were just shocking lapses. Also, I have to say the British Army did not perform well either. They were slow. They were sending raw recruits in against a very professional German army. The British had almost no success on one-on-one battles against the Germans.
What did the British public think of Churchill being brought back into the government?
Well, they were for it. He was a popular figure, and his wartime speeches enhanced his popularity. But in March of 1940, just before Norway, a Gallup poll had Chamberlain's positive rating at 57%, I believe it was. In March of 1940, 2 months before the Germans attacked France, he still had a grip on public opinion. But it proved to be a shallow grip. People were wary about it and wanted stronger leadership, but they were content with him for now.
Mm. And there was moves by people like David Lloyd George, the First World War Prime Minister, who was urging for peace. Would you think were there popular ideas for urging for peace, moving towards peace?
In September 1939, I think Britain went to war with about the polls showing 10% of the public favoring it. By March, the figure was almost up to 25, maybe even a little higher than 25% favoring it. But that had less to do with it. First place, there hadn't been any real combat in that period. Then it just had to do with the sense of the disruptive effect of war on everyone's day-to-day lives. The blackout, the food shortages, the rationing. The winter of 1940 was particularly brutal. Coal shortages for heating, people really felt it. So it was more a personal discomfort than any shock or reaction from what was happening on the continent that created that 25 to 29%. It was somewhere in there that would favor talks with Germany. Well, one of the things that was really interesting is the first period of the Battle of France, let's say from May 10th to, say, May 30th, the morale reports from mass observation show people in a near state of panic. The kind of mood swings they're going through are the kind of mood swings that psychologists normally see or talk about when something really unusual, painful event occurs, like a death in the family or a divorce, and a person's normal safeguards just are no longer available to them. There was that same kind of cycling during that period. Once Churchill got into power, during June, public opinion began to steady. But in July, he had really solidified public opinion behind him. People were steady about the war. Psychologically, they were ready for it. They were totally brought into it. That was the gift of his leadership. They felt they could truly trust him, and they were ready to follow him. And that 2-month period, that's a remarkable change to bring about in a nation of 45 million people.
What surprised me was, how did he even avoid the blame for Norway, considering, as you've already pointed out, he was so influential in the operation?
During the Norway debate, which was May 7th, May 8th, 1941, one of the pivotal moments of the war, his allies in the Conservative Party conspired during the debate not to mention him in the failures. He was mentioned as little as possible, and that included even Laborites like Clement Attlee. He was not accused or indicted, even though he played a large role in it. So the pro-Churchill group in both the Labour and Conservative Party basically gathered around him during that debate and protected him. And when it became Churchill's turn to speak at the debate, and he began to accept some responsibility, although not much, for what happened in Norway, Lord George said the First Lord should not allow himself to become a air raid shelter for other ministers, meaning the Chamberlain and the other ministers.
Why was there a pro-Churchill group within the Labour Party? Because, he is certainly not traditional Labour material. People
in the Labour Party realized that he was a unique leader, and he was the one person to lead the country through this period. Hugh Dalton said Churchill's the man, the only man for this hour. Dalton was a high-ranking Labour minister, and he was the Minister of Economic Warfare in the Churchill cabinet. Laborites recognized this. Let's say the Labour leadership did. One of the other things that seemed to happen unconsciously during that summer is people seemed to put aside their political views and realize we're all in this together. And we have a leader who's capable of giving us the best leadership that we could want. And even though there are a lot of things about him we don't like, right now we need this one quality of his, this leadership quality. And if you think about it, that's an amazingly sophisticated perception and decision for a nation, a group of ordinary people to make. But I believe that's really what happened. People just said, all right, this is a moment where we need his skill set. And when this moment passes, we'll move to people who have other skill sets. But now we need him. And I think it was basically just that simple.
So what was the nail in the coffin for Chamberlain? Because he wasn't for going, was he?
No, he wasn't for going. The nail in the coffin was the Labour Party on May 10th. That was the morning the Germans began the attack in France. And Chamberlain at the morning cabinet let it be known that he thought he should at least stay on until the outcome of the Battle of France was known. And that sort of circled around all day, all afternoon, the 10th. The Labour Party was having its annual meeting in Bournemouth. So Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, his deputy, weren't immediately available. But around 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 10th, they finally sent a reply to Chamberlain, while the War Cabinet was in session, because he read it, which said under no circumstances would Labour serve under his government. He knew it was over. There was no chance he would be able to stay in the post. But then there was a famous meeting between him, Halifax, Churchill, and the chief whip, David Margetson. There are two different accounts of what happened in that meeting. Churchill tends to portray himself more modestly in his account than Halifax portrays him in his account, which is generally considered the more accurate of the two. Halifax wrote it immediately after that meeting. Churchill didn't write it until he wrote his memoir several years later. In his memoirs, he got the date of the meeting wrong. That's how Chamberlain was ousted and Churchill came to power. Basically, the base of the Conservative Party and the Labour leadership that brought him to power. The weeks after that, he was often spoken of as an interim prime minister because a lot of people did not think that his government would last. So it was touch and go at the beginning. And when you read the debates, the 3 days debates on whether to seek a compromise peace in late May, you could see him kind of bobbing and weaving because he knows how politically vulnerable he is. Even though he somehow has to defeat Halifax, he has to do it in a way that is not going to endanger his political position. And that was an extremely difficult thing for him to do. I think that Attlee and Greenwood were on Churchill's side. I think Chamberlain went back and forth between Churchill and Halifax in that period. And I think when the debates ended on the 28th, historians have garnered from that, is that the War Cabinet came to some sort of agreement where Churchill would be allowed to fight one final battle, which became the Battle of Britain. The decision about how to proceed with Germany would be put in abeyance until the outcome of that battle was known.
I find it amazing that you've got someone running a country who's not leader of either of the main parties. It was incredible.
That was true with Lord George during the Great War. He had so detached himself from the Liberal Party during his premiership. That was the reason his government fell in 1922. One of the reasons Churchill really felt he needed the Conservative Party behind him, because he had seen how weak Lord George's rising above party had left him politically.
How was the public reaction to Churchill becoming Prime Minister? Because they had been supporting Chamberlain.
I think at the beginning it was muted. From the documents I read, I didn't get any sort of immediate outpouring of this is wonderful. People knew him, that he'd been in public life at that point for 40 years. I think it was only later in the summer when people began to see what he was accomplishing that real outflow of feeling toward him developed. He had a dicey reputation coming into the government, and in truth, the reputation, I think, was warranted. I really think Churchill had enormous talents, but I think his most important gift was leadership, not strategy. Britain's adventures later in the war in the Mediterranean were often wrong-headed, I think. His economic decisions when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s and put Britain back on the gold standard were also wrong-headed. And we know about Gallipoli. If it hadn't been for his leadership in World War II, and particularly in the summer of 1940, he would have been an interesting what might have been. There's a very famous quote of Stanley Baldwin's to the effect that When Winston was a baby, the angels came down and gave him every gift you could have. And then they suddenly said, no, we can't allow any baby to be this gifted. So they took away the gift of judgment and left the others.
So we know about the story of the fall of France and Dunkirk. And this was, undoubtedly, it was a disaster turned into a victory. How much of the turning it into a victory was down to Churchill? Churchill's driving the narrative of the occasion.
Well, first you have to define what kind of victory it was. Certainly wasn't a military victory. It was a morale victory. And yes, it rallied the countries. But I mean, as Churchill said, wars aren't won by retreats. In France, as in Norway, as I wouldn't really track the battle and looked at the sources. Again, the French had tanks were much more superior. The British were really well equipped, and they were constantly outclassed by the Germans during the Battle of France. Constantly. You had the sense that both Britain and France were tired. Somewhere their soldiers were tired. They didn't have the excellence in the fight that the German troops did. By almost any measure of equipment and resources, the British and French either matched or had an advantage over the Germans. I guess I would say Dunkirk was a great moral and morale victory for Britain. Strategically, the reason the Battle of Britain was pivotal was it was, and I mentioned in the book, the analogy between the whale and the elephant. Britain had a very large navy. But the only way it could make that naval power effective is if it denied the Germans air superiority over the Channel and over southern Britain. The Germans were the elephant. The only way they could bring their land power to bear was if the Luftwaffe defeated the RAF in the air. Air power was going to decide who won the Battle of Britain, but what hung in the balance is whether the Germans would or would not be able to invade Britain. That metaphor was used at the time, so top soldiers and sailors and politicians understood what was at stake, and the head of the home fleet toward the end of the Dunkirk operation came down to Downing Street and told Churchill flat out that he would not bring the main fleet, which was at Scarborough Flow, south of the Wash in the event of a German invasion, because that would put the big battleships within range of the Luftwaffe. It would basically be a suicide mission. And Churchill basically told him, you're going to do what I tell you.
Do you think under Churchill there was no other option than war?
There are a number of historians, John Charnley famously, who has made the case Britain could have accepted a compromise peace, and if she had, she would have saved a lot more of her empire and a lot more of her wealth. I don't know if I buy that. I think it might have been possible if Britain accepted a negotiated peace, as it had during the Napoleonic Wars for a year or two, and had the freedom to continue to rearm and train its forces. The agreement would have worked in Britain's benefit, but it seems unlikely that the Germans would have allowed the British to rearm if they had come to a negotiated settlement, and they probably would have demanded some sort of physical presence in Britain. Under certain conditions, I could see that a compromise peace would make sense, but I can't imagine the Germans agreeing to those conditions.
And Churchill wasn't making those.
He was absolutely determined. It was interesting as I read these things over and over again, and I more and more got the feelings, the question of surrender, it had almost become a personal matter for him. It was somehow tied up with his view of himself, not only his view of Britain. It was just too personal for him to ever give in. And I'm perfectly willing to believe that he would have been prepared to die if the Germans invaded and they got to Downing Street and there were no other options. I think he would have behaved the way Hitler behaved at the end of the war. I truly believe that. There was something personal in the thought of surrender that I really can't articulate quite what it was. He was prepared, as I point out in the book, to lie and cheat, to keep Britain in the war. He was fiddling with some of the documents that went to the other members of the War Cabinet. He had the chiefs of staff redo to give them a brighter tone. He would pass on correspondence with Roosevelt to other cabinet members to create the impression that Roosevelt was really more committed to Britain than, in fact, Roosevelt was. I think he was probably the first to realize that Hitler was not a normal threat, that he was a civilization threat. something that really almost what would be called a black swan event threat, something that was so uncommon. What he was basically proposing to do, in a funny way, was what the Europeans colonists did in the Americas. Simply, he was going to sweep away a whole population, bring the Germans in, and recreate a country. And what was left of the indigenous population would serve some sort of slave function. And that was what Hitler was proposing to do with that swath of land from Poland probably to Western Russia, well, it's Lieberstraum. He wanted Germany to be a world power, and Germany is smaller than the American state of Montana. He needed a vast stretch of land that would be able to support an ever-growing population and that would have the mineral and agricultural resources to be independent, so during a war, no one could threaten to shut off its supplies.
How did he get that over to the, you say he saw it and he put it in very, if you look at his rhetoric, it's very classical terms. I mean, you use play the game, and there's all kinds of Thermopylae and other things that people have sort of since added. And
what was amazing was when I would use quotes on him, just how suddenly the text would just pop up and brighten up.
Yeah, and you can almost see where he's drawing his things from once you kind of make those associations. But how did you get? How did the common man understand? Do you think they could see the same associations that he was pulling out?
I cited some of the initial, like the "We'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them in the hills" speech that he made after Dunkirk. And by the way, he sort of paraphrased something Garibaldi had said. Many people liked it, but there were also a significant minority who thought he sounded drunk or he sounded tired. And he didn't give that many speeches that summer. I think there were only 4 or 5 at the most. But I think it was their cumulative effect rather than their individual effect. And I think it was also what they saw Churchill doing, either through the BBC or through the newspapers or through friends who were in the military, that really just drew people to Churchill and made them trust him and see him as a leader, the one person who was truly capable of leading Britain out of this crisis or helping it weather it. I think people were just living day-to-day lives in the summer of 1940 and not thinking too far ahead.
No. Do you think Britain's decision to stand and fight then, not solely, but a large lump of that decision rests upon Churchill's shoulders?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. As I say, Attlee and Greenwood supported Churchill, but they didn't say much during the debate. Attlee might have stood up strongly for continuing the war. I can't imagine if Halifax was determined to seek a negotiated settlement that Chamberlain would have opposed him.
Do you think that from a people that wanted peace and to avoid war, and we get war, and do you think Churchill very much through his oratory, rhetoric, political stance actually carried the people with him on his journey to war? So when it came, they were more accepting of it.
I think that really only began to happen in May of 1940 and happened through the summer and then up into the Blitz in the autumn. It didn't happen while he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and that was from September of 1939 until May 10th of 1940. So it's only when he becomes Prime Minister he begins to impress himself on the psyche of the British people. And it's only really beginning in late June and July, I think, that his impact is such that people really do begin to follow him. It's one character, Margie Allingham says in the book, that people felt the need to live up to his expectations, to step into those roles and play those roles. But certainly not prior to his ascendancy to Downing Street. And during the first 20 days of Downing Street, I think he was so preoccupied with the war in France. I think he made maybe one speech, in his inaugural speech on the 13th, that he didn't give really much public attention. He didn't have much time for basically public propaganda.
John, that seems like a good place to leave it. Thank you. John's new book, Winston Churchill and Britain's Decision to Fight Nazi Germany in the Fateful Summer of 1940, is now available. There's a link on the website. You won't have to wait a full month for the next episode of the podcast. I'm going to try and attempt to deliver 2 episodes a month from now on the 1st and the 15th of each month. In the next episode, we'll be looking at resistance in the Japanese-occupied Philippines. Thousands of American prisoners of war were held in atrocious conditions in camps. Allied civilians had also been rounded up and detained. In the midst of this, those who had escaped internment tried to help. Don't forget, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and there's the website, www.podcast.com. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.